White had made his name and won the Victoria Cross in the Second Afghan War of 1874, 25 years before. He had spent his military career since then in India and had no experience of fighting a sophisticated, well-armed army such as that fielded by the Boers. In addition, he was probably too old and exhausted after a lifetime in the field and a serious leg injury. No training he had received or any previous experience made him ready to deal with the highly mobile and skilled marksmen of the Boer army. White's aims were to keep the forces of the two Boer states separate, to drive the Transvaal Boers from the range of hills to the north of Ladysmith, and to cut off their retreat, thereby enabling him to inflict on them a decisive defeat. White divided his army into three forces. Two of these would mount attacks on the Boer positions on Pepworth and Long Hills. White assumed the Boers would remain in position while he advanced on them. A major difficulty for the British that does not seem to have been given its due weight was that Ladysmith was known to be riddled with Boer spies. It was very unlikely that any movement of troops could be undertaken without the Boers becoming aware of it. General Ewell was sick after his harrowing march from Dundee. Command of his brigade fell to the senior battalion commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Grimwood. Grimwood's force comprised the 1st Leicesters, 2nd Royal Dublin Fusiliers, 1st and 2nd King's Royal Rifle Corps, and 1st King's Liverpools, with 2 batteries of guns, the Royal Field Artillery 13th and 69th Batteries. French's cavalry, comprising the 5th Lancers, the 18th and 19th Hussars, and the Imperial Light Horse, provided support. Grimwood, backed by French's cavalry, was to ascend Lombard's Cop, a hill to the east of Ladysmith, forming part of the ridge of hills, and turning to the northwest to attack the left flank of the Boer force on Long Hill and then Pepworth Hill. Colonel Ian Hamilton led the Central Brigade, comprising the battalions he had commanded at Eland's Lacht, the 1st Devons, the 1st Manchesters, and the 2nd Gordon Highlanders. The balance of White's substantial artillery, comprising 4 Royal Field Artillery batteries with 24 15-pounder guns, was to form a gun line in the plain. The battle was to begin with an artillery bombardment of Long Hill and Pepworth Hill. Hamilton would mount the attack frontally on Pepworth Hill from Ladysmith, while Grimwood worked his way along the ridge from the right. The 3rd Force, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Carleton, comprised 1,000 men from the Gloucester Regiment and the Royal Irish Fusiliers, with the 10th Mountain Gun Battery of the Royal Garrison Artillery. Carleton was to march north to the left of the axis of advance and occupy the gap in the hills at Nicholson's Neck. From there he was expected to cut off the retreat of the Boers from Pepworth Hill, in expectation of a successful attack on the main Boer positions on Pepworth and Long Hills, and to prevent a junction with the Orange Free State Boers approaching from the west. White's plan suffered from a number of misconceptions. He had not grasped the mobility of the Boers, all mounted and skilled horsemen, as against the slowness of his infantry, and he continued to underestimate the impact of Boer marksmanship, equipped with the most modern magazine rifles. In addition, Boer artillery was a surprise. With recently acquired guns, the Boers were still novices in their use, and many of the Boer gunners were simply burghers in arms, lacking the training and discipline of the British gunners. But the Boers were equipped with the most modern guns Europe could provide, made in France and Germany, and several of them were large guns with a range greater than the outdated British field guns. Firing from the concealment provided by the broken ground on Pepworth Hill against the British guns deployed in the open plain. White's plan to launch Carleton on his perilous night march through the Boer positions was viewed with apprehension by his staff. Even though White allocated his experienced intelligence officer, Major Adai, to accompany the force and advise on the route with the assistance of local farmers. Carleton was the first to move. Late in the evening of Sunday, 29th October 1899, Carleton led his force out of Ladysmith, following the road to the north leading to Newcastle and Dundee. Carleton's mountain artillery and reserve ammunition was carried by 200 mules. The order of march was that the Royal Irish Fusiliers led the column, followed by the mountain battery, with the Gloucesters in the rear. His destination was the gap in the hills to the northwest, called Nicholson's Neck. Carleton marched past the main Boer positions on Pepworth Hill, and then, fearing that he would be caught on the road in the valley, well short of his destination of Nicholson's Neck by the rising sun, he resolved to take his force up the hill on his left, Trengula or Hogsback, and spend the rest of the night there. While his troops were struggling up the hillside, which became progressively steep, several mounted Boers rode down the hill and through the column, firing as they went, with the result that the artillery mules bolted back down the track through the Gloucesters, who thought they were under attack and fired on the mules. The artillery mules raced through the Gloucester column, taking the mules carrying the small arms ammunition reserve with them, and disappeared into the night. Many of the gunners were dragged away with them. The Gloucesters reformed with some difficulty and continued on up the hill. The British troops occupied positions around what they thought was the summit of the hill and built stone sangars for protection. With daylight, it became apparent that Carleton's column, without any workable guns and only the ammunition they carried, were on a plateau overlooked by a number of higher peaks. The Boers assembled on these points and opened fire on the British troops. During the course of the firefight, the outlying positions held by the Gloucesters were driven in and ammunition ran low. At around 2 p.m, bugles sounded the ceasefire and the British force surrendered. Controversy surrounds the surrender. Many of the officers and soldiers present considered it to be premature. Although the fire was heavy, British casualties were low, and they appeared to be confronted by a Boer force that was only slightly larger or possibly smaller than the British. Officers of the Royal Irish Fusiliers broke their swords in protest. It would seem that the first decisions to surrender were taken by junior officers, whose men thought they were the only British left on the hill, and that once the surrender began, it was endorsed by the senior officers, including Major Adai, who expected to have been relieved some hours earlier, following successful British attacks on the Pepworth and Long Hill positions. These attacks began at dawn, when the first shots were being fired on Trengula. The Boer artillery on Pepworth Hill began to bombard Ladysmith. The British Royal Field Artillery guns attempted counter-battery fire, but found it difficult to work out the position of the Boer guns, although for a time they managed to force the Boer gunners off the Long Tom siege gun. Many of the accounts of the battle attribute the difficulties of the British gunners to the use by the Boers of smokeless ammunition. The British gunners had little experience of counter-battery fire, being more used to action against native tribesmen, as in the Sudan and on the northwest frontier of India. They had the added difficulty that they were firing from the open plain against concealed Boer guns. During the night, Grimwood marched his force out of Ladysmith and onto Lombard's Cop at Farquhar's farm, where he waited for dawn. With daylight, Grimwood found that part of his force, including his 2 batteries of guns, was missing, and French's cavalry was not positioned to support him. Once these problems were sorted out, Grimwood's men moved along Lombard's Cop to attack the supposed Boer flank on Long Hill. The Boers were no longer on Long Hill. They had moved round during the night so that they were positioned on Grimwood's right flank in the hills he was moving across. The Boers in question were the Johannesburg Commando, now led by Louis Botha, in place of Koch, fatally wounded at Elandslacht. As Grimwood's men moved forward, the Boers opened a heavy fire into their right flank, taking the British troops by surprise and causing considerable confusion. Instead of conducting an attack along the ridge and rolling up the Boer flank, the British found themselves in a desperate struggle to maintain their position on the hill under a withering fire from hidden Boer riflemen. In the centre, Long Tom fired on Ladysmith, causing panic in the town, although not a great deal of damage. British counter-battery fire was unable to track down the long-ranged French artillery piece, firing modern smokeless rounds. Hamilton launched his frontal infantry assault on Pepworth Hill, but was unable to make headway against the heavy Boer rifle fire. Waiting in Ladysmith amidst the increasing civilian panic at the Boer artillery barrage, White received a trickle of indicators from stray mule drivers and British gunners that Carleton's force, that was meant to be holding the gap at Nicholson's Neck, was in trouble. Signals by heliograph were not answered. Carleton's heliograph was on the back of one of the stampeded mules. White sent a patrol of officers to find out what had happened, but they were unable to get through the Boer lines. Thoroughly unnerved by the failure of Hamilton and Grimwood to take the hills, and the steady fire of Long Tom, together with his anxiety about Carleton at Nicholson's Neck, and rumours of an impending attack on the town by the Orange Free State Boers, White ordered his commanders to disengage and retire into Ladysmith. Grimwood's infantry, in cover on the hillside and attempting to return the Boer rifle fire, were forced to leave their positions and hurry down into the plain under intense fire. The withdrawal was in considerable confusion, which became worse as the troops streamed down the hillside. The dire situation was retrieved by the steadiness of the 2 Royal Field Artillery batteries, the 13th and the 53rd, conducting a fighting withdrawal to cover the infantry, interposing themselves between the infantry and the Boers, moving and firing in turn. The withdrawal of French's cavalry from the hillside was as disorganised as the infantry, and again the situation was retrieved by the steadiness of the Royal Field Artillery. There was one episode of respite for the British. A train arriving in the morning brought a number of naval guns and personnel from HMS Powerful in Durban. 280 officers and sailors, 4 long naval 12-pounders, and 2 45-pounder 4.7-inch guns, mounted on field gun carriages devised by Captain Percy Scott. One 12-pounder was put out of action, but another put a round on the Long Tom and rendered it inoperative. By mid-afternoon, the action was over, and the British troops were streaming back into Ladysmith, other than those of Carleton's force taken prisoner and on their way by train to Pretoria. Within days, the Boers cut the railway line south of Ladysmith, and the siege of the town began.